Chapter 5, Part 2, will look at some modern aspects of gender socialization during adolescence and emerging adulthood. I want to start by going over some recent trends that we've seen. Up to this point, we've considered adolescent development from a gendered perspective during the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. More recently, we've seen a trend towards more egalitarian gender values, where more and more Americans are supporting the idea that, hey, regardless of your gender, you can do and be whatever and whoever you want to be. This includes gender roles, careers, sexuality, anything that is traditionally influenced by gender. However, somewhere between a fourth and a third of Americans still support traditional gender roles. So, regardless of this trend, our development is still heavily impacted by our gender socialization. So let's dive into that a little bit more. Gender in the West, specifically during our developmental period of interest, is characterized by something we call the gender intensification hypothesis, where, beginning at the early years of adolescence, both boys and girls see an increase in focus put on gender. During our teenage years, the differences that exist between men and women become more pronounced. We become more aware of them. And oftentimes we strive to achieve the ideal woman and the ideal male as part of our social lives. This heavily intensifies the degree of socialization we experience, where our peers, the media we consume, our parents, our teachers, the courses we take at school are all shaping us, pushing us towards those more traditional gender expectations. We see an increased pressure to conform, to match those expectations coming internally as well, because of the emphasis put on gender. We know that even though gender intensification happens for both males and females, it tends to be more intense for girls. Women report higher levels of self-consciousness and greater interest in forming intimate relationships. Those together tend to push a greater experience of intensification for girls. However, for adolescent boys, the gender intensification hypothesis can help us explain why we see so many risky behaviors in adolescent boys compared to girls. We talked about how cognition during adolescence contributes to risk-taking, but those risks tend to be higher for boys. Part of the reasoning here is because the expected role of male tends to involve taking risks. Dangerous sexual behaviors, drugs, alcohol, dangerous driving, all of these different potentially harmful expectations, coupled with the expectation that you shouldn't really care about school, can produce some lifelong impacts on adolescent male development. Another aspect of socialization during adolescence is the differential gender socialization hypothesis. This states that girls and boys, while both being impacted by gender socialization, are being socialized very differently from within their own cultures. These different sources of socialization include family, peers, and schools, but what we sometimes notice is that families will socialize girls in a more intense way than boys, but peers will then socialize boys more intensely than girls, and so on and so forth. So not only are males and females experiencing different degrees of socialization, that might change across different contexts. Big part of the socialization is implicit, meaning that we are not necessarily aware of it. Even though, of course, a lot of the time, advertisements, things our parents say to us, we are aware. Even our peers sometimes will make very obvious statements like, girls should do this, boys should do this. But a lot of this kind of flies under the radar, where it's just a part of our society and we don't necessarily notice it. Things like advertisement, things like how course offerings are presented to males versus females, things like the clothes your parents buy for you, and so on and so forth. are all part of gender socialization. Interestingly enough, we know that teachers are even part of this aspect of gender socialization. Boys and girls are thought by teachers to have very different interests and abilities, and because of that, teachers will ask their male students to volunteer to answer questions about science and mathematics, while they tend to ask their female students to volunteer more information about arts and music and creative aspects of schooling. This just furthers that degree of gender socialization. We also know that teachers expect boys to be more aggressive, and because of that, tend to respond less harshly when adolescent boys are aggressive. But when girls express the slightest bit of aggression, teachers tend to kind of clamp down on them very intensely. That's just one example of differential gender socialization, again, coming from the teachers. This happens at school, on a wider level, administrators, advertisements in the hallway, peers at school, and it also happens at home and even out in the community. Another aspect of that is, of course, the expectation that girls are compliant, and then there are negative repercussions when they don't go with the flow. That's another great example. One thing I mentioned as part of gender socialization is the role that the media plays in developing our expectations. And I want to just give you one example here. I know they're not as popular as they used to be, but if we look at research done relatively recently, looking at magazines, and specifically the way they promote body image, we can see how girls and boys, to some extent, are shaped to develop certain gender expectations. Magazines targeted at adolescent girls tend to focus on fashion, beauty, and health, specifically weight control. Those are the primary things that articles are about, that advertisements are about, that the different products being tried out, different quizzes, all of these things exist in magazines, and they tend to focus on these three very traditionally female aspects. Again, even the advertisements often focus on fashion, beauty, and weight gain. We know research has shown that exposure to this type of media actually correlates with lower body satisfaction. So not only are girls learning what those gender expectations are, we're also seeing sometimes negative outcomes on their overall psychological well-being. We have research to suggest that similar things are happening with social media right now. Instagram, Facebook, so on and so forth. Here's an example of a magazine that used to be very popular among adolescent girls, at least when I was that age. They're not as common now, but again, the same trends are happening with social media. So some problems that are coming from the differential socialization that girls receive. An emphasis on thinness is one of the biggest problems that we see. This creates negative body image. It has been correlationally shown to relate to the development of eating disorders, and even higher degrees of bullying. In fact, we know that the majority of girls during high school report going on a diet at some point. So, the way we address bodies in advertisements on social media not only teaches girls what they should look like in order to be considered feminine, it also has some potentially negative outcomes. This is one reason we've seen a push recently to have more diverse representation of healthy body styles or body types, in media. Boys, on the other hand, as I mentioned, are differentially socialized. This is a picture of a video game targeted at boys, adolescent, but also adult males. And you can see from this advertisement or this video game cover that most socialization coming specifically from the media for adolescent boys emphasizes aggression. We see teasing being encouraged, mocking your friends, making fun of your friends in a very verbal way. But we also see, if you're familiar with media targeted at adolescents, a great emphasis on characters, on celebrities, having this fear of being labeled a failed man that continues to pop up even in modern society. So, one outcome of that is an increase in the use of physical aggression when your status as a man is threatened. You'll notice in this picture, there's of course a very obvious indicator of physical aggression and the gun or even guns used, but you'll also notice that in the background, there's an American flag. That's communicating some aspects of what it means to be a man. Even the way the musculature of this character, the beard that the character wears, all aspects of advertisements like this socialize these very traditional and sometimes harmful gender expectations. All of this is supposed to work together to establish an individual's social status. And when we see these things emphasized, we see higher rates of vandalism, risky driving, higher instances of fighting, and even more criminal behavior. We know that most adolescent boys support the statement that a young man should be tough. And when they support this statement, they're more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, to engage in risky sex behaviors, which of course have very serious and long-term negative outcomes. So that's differential gender socialization. The next aspect of this that I want to look at is the cognitive component, because of course this isn't all being passively consumed by us. We actually get to think and process the different socialization cues we're receiving during our teenage years. The cognitive developmental theory of gender kind of adds on to socialization to include that component of thought, where we actually rely on the idea of gender to help us organize what we think about the world, to categorize things, to simplify things. Our brains like to create shortcuts, where I can look at something and know what it's for and who's it for, because that helps me cope better with the world. Cognitive developmental theory of gender believes or stipulates the idea that this kind of cognitive miserhood, or even laziness, you can think of it, is one thing that motivates us to develop concepts of gender. We, of course, develop this throughout childhood, where we start out by developing an understanding of gender identity, or an understanding of ourselves as male or female. This typically happens around age 3. And once that happens, we start sorting things into male and female categories. That's for boys, toy guns are for boys, dress-up clothes are for girls, dolls are for girls, athletic equipment is for boys, and so on and so forth. So you see this starting to happen at a very young age. From there, we develop what's called self-socialization, where because we want to be consistent with our idea of gender, individuals will start choosing activities and toys and ways of dress and friends and interests based off of those categories that they've created. And then, of course, when we get to adolescence, that intensification kicks in, and this all kind of starts to go haywire. So, it can be easy to understand from this cognitive perspective why it's so easy to fall back to those traditional gender expectations. Our brains are almost programmed to think that way sometimes. But of course, we can still socialize gender in a way that allows for more flexibility, less rigidity, more acceptance of people who don't neatly fit into one of these categories. Another approach to this, gender schema theory, stipulates that we actually develop schemas or categories for appropriate gendered behaviors in addition to interests. So we view the world as male or female. And this dichotomy, again, this is for boys, that's for girls. And not only do we self-select interests and activities and toys and friends based off of that, we actually remember, pay attention to, and remember things that fit our own gender schema better. Meaning that if an adolescent girl is walking down the street and she sees a magazine targeted at her gender demographic, she's more likely to pay attention to that and then to remember it over a magazine targeted at a male. So, a quick example, we know I'm a girl. We developed that early on during childhood. Later on in childhood, I learned that girls are supposed to like dolls. So when I go to the store, I'm going to pay more attention and remember dolls. This kind of just furthers the development of those gender expectations and even gender identity. I'm actually going to stop there for video 2. Video 3 will pick up by looking at the idea of masculinity, femininity, androgyny, and then we'll look at some different cultural categories to see how these gender norm expectations change depending on what cultures we're looking at.